Good evening. My name's Omine Abu, and I work for the City of Glendale Water Services Department. Joining me tonight is Joanne Toms, who also works for the City of Glendale Water Services Department, and James Lauder, our guest presenter with Watershed Management Group. I'd like to welcome everyone to tonight's class on Sonoran Desert Edibles. Let's cover some webinar logistics for those who are new to our Green Living series. Attendees are muted and the class will be recorded. The recording will be available on the city's water conservation website and YouTube channel in about a week. You can type your questions and comments in the Q&A or chat functions, and Joanne and I will read and respond to as many as we can throughout the webinar. The class is scheduled to be 1.5 hours long. We will aim to stay on track as we want to be respectful of your time. If you experience any significant technical difficulties, please contact Joanne Toms via email or phone. Her email is jtoms, T-O-M-S, @glendaleaz.com, or you can call her at 623-930-3596. After this presentation, we'll follow up with an email that includes a copy of the PowerPoint, resources, recording, and a link to the survey. If you complete the survey, you'll be entered to win a free gift card from a local nursery. So don't miss out on a chance. And all you have to do is fill out a 5-minute survey. It's super quick. Let's go over some Zoom attendee features if you're new to this. Here is what your current view might resemble. You can play around with the features so you're comfortable. You can click and drag the vertical bar located in between the presenter and the presentation to enlarge or shrink the presentation view. You can also adjust the audio settings in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. Feel free to send comments using the chat button or share your questions using the Q&A button. Joanne and I will do our best to answer questions during the presentation as they come in. Additionally, there will be breaks for questions throughout, and we should also have enough time for James to answer questions at the end of his presentation. Of course, want to share a cool resource here. Did you know that the city has a 3,000 square foot desert food forest located at the Glendale Xeriscape Demonstration Garden? This area of the garden was installed in 2018 and funded by the Arizona Department of Forestry and Fire Management grant. The food forest showcases desert edibles, trees, shrubs, perennials, and succulents that homeowners can successfully grow, harvest, and enjoy in their own landscapes. Drop by for a visit. The garden is free and open every day from dawn to dusk. You can also visit the link on the slide to learn more about the plants in the desert food forest. I'll type the link in the chat and it will also be included in the follow-up email. So be sure to stop by and see the different types of plants in person. Lastly, this workshop wouldn't be possible without our friends at Watershed Management Group, and I'm very excited to introduce you to our presenter tonight. Born in Eindhoven, Netherlands, James traveled around a lot in his youth, eventually settling in Oregon, where he studied fluvial geomorphology and environmental restoration. For the last 7 years, James has worked in conservation, restoration, and monitoring throughout the Western US. He eventually made his way to Arizona, working as a botanist around Flagstaff and the Grand Canyon. Finally moving to Tucson, where he continued to work as a botanist, and eventually with Watershed Management Group, where he is a project manager with their co-op program, doing community installations for water harvesting infrastructure at local residences. Throughout all his travels, he has been an active forager of wild edibles and is excited to continue to explore the Sonoran Desert and Desert Southwest. Everyone, please help me welcome James Lauder. Thanks, James, for joining us tonight.
Yeah, excited to be here. So I guess we can just hop right in then. Let me just share my screen. There we go. All right, how's that looking?
Looks perfect, James.
Okay, awesome. So we'll just get started then. So welcome to Sonoran Desert Edibles, cultivating native edible landscapes. As was mentioned, my name is James Lauder. I'll be presenting today. So before we hop into the presentation, Watershed also offers a number of other learning opportunities. Some of these on this present slide have already passed, but if you hop on our website, you can find future presentations based around water harvesting in the desert Southwest, and you can learn about different systems that you can set up, whether that's using rainwater or gray water systems. So feel free to check that out at watershed.org/learn/classes/field studies. You can also navigate that just from our website. You just go to watershed.org or watershedmg.org. So yeah, just as a primer, I'd just like to ask if you type into the chat, what are you all looking to learn about today about desert edibles? And so I can't actually see the chat function right now, so I can't see what people are typing in, but hopefully that's being monitored.
Okay, James. So I have someone saying that I'm interested in some sustainable foraging opportunities, some ID features, when the best time to harvest. There's also how to better utilize what the desert offers. And then someone also mentioned, I'm designing my backyard and would like to include edibles within there. And then I'll just read a few more. There's a lot of great responses in here. Identification of specific plants that are not common. Someone said, any information that you have, just what they are, I'm a novice. But there's a lot of great responses here.
Yep, awesome. I was actually able to find the chat as well. So hopefully I can now read these as they come up. But yeah, hopefully most of these questions we are going to address as we go. And if you feel like you have anything specific, we're going to break out the presentation into a number of different sections. And after each section, there'll be a moment for questions afterwards. So if we can hold off on questioning till we get to one of those pause moments, and then we can kind of address each specific topic as we go. And then at the very end, we'll also have a little bit of time to kind of address anything that hasn't been answered yet. So if your question doesn't get answered during one of these pauses, feel free to bring it back up at the end and hopefully we can get everything addressed. But so if you look on the left side of the screen, you can see all the different topics that we're going to cover today. And so just going to work through all of these as we go. So yeah. So first I'd like to start off with just the idea of our changing relationship to food. And I have another primer question for you. And I'm just curious, how abundant do you think the desert is in relationship to food? Do you think there's a lot of accessibility to food out there? Yeah, sorry, I can try and speak up. How abundant do you think that food is in the desert? Do you think there's a lot of opportunities for food, or do you think that there is very little, or somewhere in between? So we're getting a couple of different answers. Yeah. Yeah, so a lot of you are saying that there is a lot of food that is available. And that's pretty true. The desert is actually an abundant place. And just knowing where to access that is kind of the knowledge that you need to know where all of it is. So kind of jumping in from there is, but if you're not getting your food from the desert, where are you getting your food? And I will answer that myself, is that personally I get most of what I eat from the grocery store. And the way that we source our food today has generally created a disconnect between ourselves and what we eat in our natural environment. We're pretty much able to get any food that we want during any time of the year. There's always bell peppers or squash on the shelves. You can get them whenever you go there. And this is achieved because we have this vast global interconnected food system. If you ever take a moment to look at a label, you may notice that a lot of the produce that's on the shelf is made in Mexico or other places in Central America, or even further afield in different countries. And this means that we generally have to ship our food over vast distances to get it to the places where people eat it, in contrast to where it's being grown. So finding local food sources is a good way to kind of offset this larger underlying cost of this food system that we have. And it allows you to understand what is actually available in your environment and get an idea of how plants exist in a natural landscape, and that you can't always have access to citrus year round. And so to kind of explore that idea, kind of as a contrast to our current system, we can look at how the native tribes that settled in the region in the Southwest managed their food systems. So this is an image of cultivation plots of the Acamel Othum, or people of the river. And they settled in the area around the Salt River, so just east of y'all in Phoenix. And in this picture, you can see these red polygons. And these are all the cultivation sites that the native tribes had. And you can see that they're spread out across the landscape, integrated into it, and kind of diversely shaped. In addition, you can also see that they had a large canal network. So not only are they utilizing what's already in the land, they're also manipulating it and using the resources they have to create a varied cultivated system. So this picture is a rendition and a somewhat idealization of what their food system looked like. And you can see that there is a huge abundance of food that is presented here. And it was all integrated in the landscape. There's both wild edibles alongside cultivated natives and also introduced species. And we'll get into what those terms mean in just a second. And all their food that they consumed was based on what was seasonally available. And so they had this understanding of the land and the plants around them. And so hopefully through your journey of foraging and finding wild edibles, and potentially also growing your own food, you can become more connected with where your food is coming from and understand the abundance that the desert has to offer. So I guess this is a question slide. It's supposed to say question on it, but I don't know if anybody has any pressing questions on that. But if not, we're going to hop straight into the next section. All right, so the next one is kind of these native and other terms that I brought up a little bit earlier. And so understanding these different terminologies will also help you know what to forage and the different practices around them, and also help you understand some of the things that I'm discussing in future slides. So the first thing to address is the word native. And now we're no longer talking about native peoples. Yeah, I can try and speak up a little bit more. I'm sorry if everybody's having a difficulty hearing me. Let me just take a sip of water. Let me just see if I can do something to help out. So yeah, so the first term that we're going to address is the word native. And now we're not talking about native peoples, we're talking about native plants. And so the definition of a native plant is a plant that is a part of a balance of nature that has developed over hundreds of thousands of years in a particular region or ecosystem. And as a side note, the word native should always be used with a geographic qualifier. So what's native to Arizona may not necessarily mean native to the Sonoran Desert. And we can kind of explore that idea with these two maps here. So on the left, we have a map of the Sonoran Desert region. And you can see that it extends, well, it is this, this color right here, kind of this brown and green. And you can see that it is in parts of Arizona in the southwest section, a little bit of California, and then northern Mexico as well. And then the picture on the right is the extent of the saguaro, probably one of the most iconic plants that grows in the Sonoran Desert. And although these two maps overlap, you can see that the saguaro does not grow in the entirety of the Sonoran Desert. And that'll be true of most plants that we talk about. So understanding where plants are native and where you can find them is important to foraging as well. So the next term to talk about is, yeah, I'm sorry, I'm trying to talk really loud. Is it better if I sit closer to the mic? Is that a little bit better?
Yes, that's better, James. Thank you.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, sorry if people can't hear me. So the next thing to talk about is exotic versus invasive. So an exotic species is a plant that's not native to the continent on which it's now found. A good example here are citrus fruit. A lot of people grow citrus fruit around in Tucson and Phoenix, and it generally doesn't come from this desert region. Invasive is a plant that is both non-native and able to establish on many sites, grow quickly, and spread to a point of disrupting other plant communities and ecosystems. And although that is the textbook definition, in my years of working in restoration, there are also native invasives. And that kind of ties in with the idea of where you find a plant. And so one of the biggest issues that I can discuss on that is encroachment of trees inside of meadows. So although specific trees are native to a region, we don't want them to encroach on certain places. And so they could be invasive, even though the difference between where we want them and where we don't want them is only a matter of 10 feet. So it's good to understand the different plants that are in the area so you can understand where your best foraging places can be and where you can take more or less. And we'll get into that in a little bit. The next two terms to discuss are wild versus domestic. And so wild is a plant that does not need human help to reproduce and maintain itself over time in an area where it's native. And domestication is the process whereby plants have evolved into crop plants through artificial selection. And that's basically taking a wild plant, like the one on the left, this is wild cotton, and we've selected the ones that we like the most to present the features that we like. So in our cultivated cotton, you can see that it has a much larger of these cotton balls, which help to distribute the seeds. They're not quite as effective anymore because of how we've grown them, but they're much more useful to us. Another really good example is corn. So on the left is kind of one of the ancestors of corn, and on the right is our modern day corn. And you can see that there are vast differences between the two. The one on the left is much smaller. The seeds are much less prevalent versus what we've come to know as corn. And this is really good to know because the species that you find out in the wild may not present in the same way that we think of plants that we buy in our grocery store. So you need to be open-minded as you go foraging around, and you're not going to find giant corn heads, but you may be able to eat the grains and seeds that come off of other plants. And they may be just as delicious or nutritious. And the final two terms we have are naturalized versus weed. So naturalized species is a non-native plant that does not help humans or does not need human help to reproduce. And a weed is a non-native or native plant that is not valued in a place that's growing. And these terms, as well as invasive, are really good to know when you're harvesting, because generally there's limits on how much you want to take. But if you know if a plant is invasive or a naturalized or a weed, you generally don't have those some sort of restrictions. And it's generally beneficial to actually harvest more than less. A really good example for that in the desert Southwest is London Rocket, or this picture in the top right. It's a mustard. It grows pretty pervasively throughout our urban system, and it's an invasive that some people classify as naturalized. And that basically means that if you really like eating its leaves or its seeds, there's no problem in the idea of over harvesting these plants. So yeah, are there any questions on those terms or concepts that we just went over?
I'm checking the chat right now. Maybe I'm not seeing anything right now. Oh, so Charles said, would you consider morel mushrooms a native plant?
So in a very technical sense, they're a fungus, and I would consider them generally native. They spread naturally after fires. And so in Arizona, you can actually collect morels that have grown natively throughout the region. I think they're a little bit more prevalent in different regions, but you can still find them in the desert Southwest.
Thank you, James. As of now, I don't see any other questions.
Okay, so moving right along. The next section, becoming a botanist. So I don't actually expect everybody here to become a professional level botanist, but I think a basic understanding of how to ID plants and understanding the different characteristics of plants is really important, both for your safety and also knowing what is good to eat. On this concept, these two flowers that we have right here may look relatively similar, although there are some good differences between them. But it's good to know that one of them, the one on the right, if you eat any part of it, is very toxic, and at the very least will make you sick, well as the plant on the left, a Oenothera or morning glory, has edible and medicinal properties to it. Another concept too, no, well, actually, I'll do that in a minute. So another thing is understanding the differences between closely related species, because some of them have very delicious fruit, as in the case of this banana yucca, whereas another very similar looking plant may not have as tasty of fruit. So just having that experience and that know-how will help you both protect yourself and also give you the most enjoyable experience. So at the very least, if you do not want to go any further into the taxonomy or the botany of plants, you should understand the basic form of how plants grow. And that's mostly because certain aspects of plants are edible and certain aspects aren't, or ones are better to eat than others. So in this picture, there's 5 main structures: the flowers, fruit, stem, leaves, and roots. And as you go foraging, sometimes you're only going to eat the roots, and sometimes you're only going to eat the fruit, and sometimes you can eat the entire plant. And so it kind of depends on what plants you're foraging. A really good example of this is rhubarb. And so probably a lot of you know that you can eat rhubarb and it's quite delicious in pies or jams. But the leaves are actually toxic. And if you eat them, you will become sick. So knowing which parts of a plant to eat is really important. So if you're more interested in continuing along this line, I'm not going to spend too much time in this. The next step in IDing plants is understanding leaf form and leaf margins, and also how they come off a plant. So there's all these different terms. A lot of them are in Latin, and I'm not going to go through them. But if you are interested in getting more deeper into botany and to IDing plants, this is a really good place to start. Another good thing to know is how the flowers are formed as well. And again, I'm not going to get into these specific things. We're not having a botany or taxonomy course. But if you're interested, those are 2 good places to go. There are a lot of good resources out there. Books like Botany in a Day are a really good starting resource. But if you want to get much more deeper into the technicality of it, plant identification terminology is a kind of a Bible of all the different terms of how to describe a plant. And then you can have a number of different levels of plant identification keys. Kind of Arizona flora is our highest one here. But there are a lot of other picture books and easier to access identification books as well. So check out your local bookstore and find something that works well for you. So jumping back to the idea of why you want to know a plant before you go out there and harvest. So not only is it potentially dangerous to you, there are a number of plants out there that are actually protected for one reason or another. So knowing what these plants are before you go out is really important. And we'll get to resources on how to find out what plants are protected and the ways to get through them at the end of the slides when we hit the resources. So we'll kind of circle back around to this. But another reason to understand why it's important to harvest plants is that it's good to have like a level of stewardship. So when we harvest, we are taking a part of the plant. Potentially, we're outright killing a plant if we're harvesting its roots, or if we take the whole plant itself. Or potentially, we are damaging it by eating its leaves or its flowers, or also harvesting its fruit. All of those are going to reduce its potential to reproduce in the future. And so when you come across plants, you want to make sure that you have a level of understanding of how much to take. In the example that I have here with these are called blue dicks. They occur throughout Arizona. In the Sonoran Desert, they generally occur in small groups and small populations of 1 to 5. But if you go up in higher elevations of Mount Lemmon or the Sierra Anchas or different places, then you can find them in much larger populations. So there's a couple simple rules to follow when you're harvesting in any given area. If there are only a few plants, like in the example of only finding 3 or 4 blue dicks, don't harvest them, especially if taking that plant is going to damage or kill it. If you come across a single giant oak and you're just taking acorns, that's less of a priority and kind of falls into some of these other rules that are coming up. If you're only going to take a part of a plant and not outright kill it, like its leaves or flowers, only take a small percentage off of each plant. The general rule is about 10 to 25% from any individual plant. And you want to spread your harvesting across many individuals so that lessens the impact on each one. And finally, when you're taking fruit, very similar to if you're taking leaves or flowers, only take some from each plant. And then in addition, you want to leave the largest and most productive fruit on the plants so that when they reproduce, we have the best next generation of that plant. And that's kind of generally how we got our cultivated plants as well. We selected the best looking fruit and the best looking plants, and we allowed those to grow, or we consumed or got rid of the other ones. And now we have much more productive plants that suit to our needs. So although we're not necessarily trying to domesticate a prickly pear, it's still a really good practice so that they can maintain their own populations. The one exception to this rule is understanding those invasives or weeds. So as I mentioned before, London rocket is an invasive. So if you find that, don't feel bad about picking every single one of them because we are actively trying to remove it in our region. So yeah, are there any questions on plant terms or foraging stewardship?
All right, let's give people, oh, Charles. So he says in upstate New York, the ginseng hunters effectively eradicated the plant from the areas. What is an example of this in Arizona?
So although it wasn't eradicated, barrel cactus almost went extinct because back in the day, they used to make barrel cactus fruit, or barrel cactus candy, sorry, and they would take the entire plant, cut it up, candy it, and then we nearly eradicated the entire barrel cactus population. Luckily, we caught that before it happened, and they're coming back, but they would be in much greater numbers if that had not happened.
Thank you, James, for that. I didn't even know that happened, so that's something new that I learned already. Carly said, are you going to go into poisonous plants more? Are there many here?
So I'm not going to specifically go into poisonous plants. I think if we got kind of into defining a bunch of different ones, it would be a very long presentation. There's a lot of good resources out there that will describe different plants that you should and should not harvest. There are a couple poisonous plants out here. Luckily, not as many or as many as there are in other places. So a lot of the plants we have here, you're more going to have to worry about spines or thorns versus them actually being poisonous. So yeah.
And Joanne had a wonderful comment. She said, I took a desert edible class at the Desert Botanical Garden, and the instructor said, keep some fruit for the native wildlife. I like that don't be greedy message, share the bounty.
Yep. So that is very true. As you are foraging and harvesting, you are also taking resources away from the natural wildlife out there. So if you take all the fruit or all the plants in a certain area, not are you only damaging those plants, you're also potentially damaging natural wildlife populations too.
And Earl also mentioned, what about mentioning you cannot collect plants or plant parts on state, federal, or private property without expressed permission?
That's a very good point, and I believe I'm going to touch base a little bit on that in just a minute, or maybe I have already. But just to reiterate, when you go out and harvest, you also need to make sure that the place that you are in allows you to harvest those specific plants. Sometimes in these cases, you need to get permits to harvest specific plants. Sometimes you cannot harvest there at all. So some of the resources that I'm going to present later will allow you to check on those specific regulations. And so it's kind of know before you go. I can't tell you all the specific ones. I don't know them all personally, but I always check before I go and harvest.
Thank you, James. I love that. Know before you go. That's very catchy. Mm-hmm. That's all the comments that we have in the chat right now.
All right, so moving right on. Okay, getting started. So now we've kind of gone through a bunch of the terminology. What do you actually need to have before you go out there? So these are all the tools that I generally bring out with me. There's a nice little list on the left, but this picture is actually my kit. I'm missing a couple items, which we'll get to in a second. But generally, this is what I have with me anytime I go out and harvest. I cannot stress enough sun protection in the desert. So however you would like to do that, sun hats, long sleeves, sunscreen, please make sure you bring it out. Heat stroke and heat-related illnesses are a big problem, especially if you're harvesting in the summer. There's also been a number of cases of people who get lost while they're harvesting, so come prepared. Water is especially important as well. As a general rule, I would say bring 2 quarts plus an additional quart of water for every hour you plan to be gone. And that'll make sure that you have enough for while you're gone, and also just a little bit extra just in case something happens. If you get a little bit lost or you end up going further afield than you think you will. But that being said, just be safe when you go out there. Kind of cover these other tools that I like to bring. First off, a nice sharp knife. It's just a general good tool for cutting off generally any part of a plant. Sometimes it's better or easier to use something else like pruning shears, especially if you're going to use it on a woodier part of a plant. I also very much like to bring a multi-tool that has pliers on it. It's really good for grabbing spiny things or for pulling spiny things out of yourself. I have many a time gotten cactus spines, and if not for this tool, I would have had a much less pleasant experience. A couple digging tools are nice to have. Here are a couple different options. There's a short pick, and also I really like to use my folding shovel. It has a little pick on the back. It also gives me the option of using it as a shovel or folding it away entirely. In addition, gloves. I nearly forgot. Gloves are really helpful, especially in the desert Southwest. Here I have a pair of thin rubber gloves. It's also a good idea to have a pair of leather gloves with you, depending on the situation, how much dexterity you need, and how much protection you need. Some of the other tools that I bring with me that I did not have on hand for that photo are a folding saw. This is really nice for cutting prickly pear pads. It just cuts through them a little bit nicer. In addition, the tool on the right is called a hori hori, or my very first one was called a functional blade or functional knife of utility blade. And I actually really like these. They're a multi-purpose tool that allows you to both cut. They have a bit of a saw edge on them. But what I very much like them for is digging up roots and tubers. They have just the shape of the blade and the handle just makes them very useful for that. So I very much like my hori hori. In addition, a good backpack. This is actually my partner's mushroom foraging backpack. It's very fancy. You do not need to go this fancy when you're getting your tools. A simple 5-gallon bucket is also a very basic carrying implement, and I actually think it's better for collecting spiny stuff like Cholla Buds or prickly pear fruit, and that prevents it from stabbing you as you're carrying it out. Another useful tool to have is a burlap sack or even a pillowcase for collecting those less spiny items. Basically, anything that you feel will help you carry out what you're collecting. And you may have noticed I have some nice items and a number of them, but you generally don't need to get every single thing when you're starting. Think about what you want to collect, and then you can start off very basic. You know, if you want to go out and collect some prickly pear buds or fruit, all you need is a bucket and a pair of tongs. Maybe you have them for the grill already, or you have a pair for the kitchen. Very simple. You just go out with those and you're already set. So don't feel discouraged by the fact that I showed you a bunch of different tools. Those are just different options that you can have depending on what you want to collect. Another tool to have is just your own ability to collect and explore a new flavor palette. So as I kind of mentioned, a lot of the plants that are wild may have cultivated relatives, but they're not all necessarily going to taste the same or have the same sort of textures. But just being open to the different flavors that you may encounter is part of being a forager. And kind of to circle back on something that somebody I believe mentioned earlier, is that, again, some of the plants are poisonous, and even plants that are edible or labeled as edible may give certain people, some people may have allergic reactions or different adverse reactions to them. So when you're out harvesting and you're trying something new, it's always a really good idea to kind of test it before you eat a lot of it. And two of the simple methods to do that are you can take some of it and rub it on your skin. I wouldn't suggest this for something very spiny again, but if you process the spiny plants a little bit, you can rub that on your skin and wait a little while. If you have a reaction, that means you probably shouldn't eat it. And then you can do this in combination, or if you're feeling a little bit more confident, eat just a small portion of what you've foraged. And then if you have an adverse reaction to that, if you have some upset stomachs or whatever reaction that may be, do not continue to eat that plant. So again, be safe while you're out foraging, know what you're trying to forage, and then even if you are pretty certain you know what it is, it's always a good place to test. I'm not going to get deep into mushroom foraging, but mushrooms are generally, except for a couple general species, relatively hard to ID and can have very adverse effects. So I would say be very careful if you're going to forage mushrooms. So yeah, are there any questions on tools or safety while you're out there?
Hey, James, can you go back to the last slide?
Yeah.
So Randy had a question asking, are the Cholla buds shown on the white plate around the berries?
Yeah, so those are Cholla buds. And so I'm not exactly sure how these are prepared. They look like they may have been fermented, like a light fermentation or a light pickling, actually is probably how they did it. You can see there's no more glaucoids on them. And the glaucoids are not the big spines, but the tiny little spines on cactuses that are actually much more, are a much bigger problem and cause a lot more irritation and much harder to get out, especially if you just pop them in your mouth and you get them all in your mouth. It's a very unpleasant experience. But yeah, and then also in that picture, it looks like those are, I believe, Palo Verde flowers, or that's my best guess. So.
Thank you, James. We don't have any more comments in the chat, but I really love this slide to just show what you can achieve by foraging from the desert. And I love the title of A Flavor Frontier because that is just amazing. And of course, we want to explore and experience the different palettes that the desert has to offer. Melissa also commented, I just harvested some with my daughter. And so that's wonderful that you've already started harvesting. And Charles had a comment, where would you find fiddleheads?
So fiddleheads are going to be at higher elevations. You're not necessarily going to find them on the desert floor, but if you get up into slightly more mountainous environments in wetter areas, you'll be able to find fiddleheads. Like a side note on fiddleheads is preparation is also really important before consumption. Depending on the species that you go for, you may need to boil them for longer or cook them for longer to remove some volatiles that people find to irritate their stomach or just find unpleasant. It also helps to remove a bit of bitter flavor. So yeah, that picture of fiddleheads is probably coming from a higher elevation area. And that's kind of the discussion about, plants that may be native to Arizona may not be necessarily native to the Sonoran Desert, but they could also be native to the Sonoran region, which does include these sky islands.
Thank you so much for sharing your expertise. As of right now, we don't have any more questions in the chat.
Okay. So the next section is harvesting with the seasons. So different plants will be best harvested in different seasons or different times of the year. And this is because each plant has its own unique growing cycles. The climate and other factors determines when they're going to produce fruit or when they're sending nutrients to their leaves or roots, which is going to make them taste a lot better, kind of depending on which direction it's going. Some of you, if you've already harvested, may have noticed that if you collect the leaves of a plant after it's already started flowering, they're much more bitter than if you collect the leaves before they start to flower. And that's because the plant stops sending nutrients to its leaves and starts sending them into the flowers and into fruit production. So it's best to know kind of when to choose when to harvest plants. And although most foraging books will have a description on when and where to harvest, it's also really good to create your own harvesting calendar because that allows you to choose the species that you're most interested in and be able to put them into a format that is most helpful to you. This is not my personal harvesting calendar. It's just a very beautiful one. And so you can see, you can make it as nice as you want, or you can have a very basic Excel document if that's what works best for you. So we'll just run through a couple of the major, or 5 of the potential plants that you can harvest in each season, starting with spring. So as you may have noticed, the barrel cactus are in fruit right now. We're probably kind of tapering off of the barrel cactus season, but those are really nice to collect and turn into chutneys. You can also use the seeds as an additive to granola or your morning cereals. It's really nice. Blue dicks, as I mentioned before, they have tuberous roots, which can be harvested and roasted. Chickweed, which is that top center one, makes a really good salad green. dock flower and stalks. Dock is also known as wild rhubarb. So their stalks before they flower are very tasty, but you can also eat the flowers. And then finally, biscuit root, which is on the bottom right. Those have been a very traditional food source for a lot of the native tribes, and you can either roast them or you can dry them and pound them into a flour. So yeah. Next, we have summer with acorns, and acorns have also been a very traditional food source for the native tribes around here. It's been said that the Quercus emryi, or the emery oak, was made for humans, and that the white oak was made for the animals. And that is because the emery oak generally has tastier seeds, and they're acorns. They're a little bit sweeter and have less of the tannins, which make the acorns bitter. So if you're selecting between the two, I would definitely go for the emery oak over the white oak. Mesquite beans, probably one of the most well-known ones to harvest in the Sonoran Desert. There's a couple different varieties that you can harvest from, and make sure you harvest the dried pods, because if you collect moist pods, they can have a fungus that grow in them, and that can be toxic to people. Purslane, bottom right, is another really good salad green. I actually, as I used to do field monitoring and walk around for about 8 hours a day, would just harvest this and eat it as I walked around. It's a really pleasant little snack. Saguaro fruit is one of these plants that you definitely want to check to make sure that you can harvest before you go out and get it. In a lot of places, it's actually illegal to collect these. So this is kind of a no before you go. Check the rules and regulations. If you happen to have a saguaro in your yard that's flowering and fruiting, you can collect that. But on public lands, it's generally not allowed. And then finally, we have wild grapes and leaves. And these wild grapes are really delicious, I think, much tartar than what you can find in the grocery store. But you can also eat the young leaves, and you can turn them into dolmas. And I'll answer all those questions right at the end. And that's a really good point to make there, Andy. So in autumn, again, barrel cactus fruit, they kind of have a bi-seasonal fruiting. You can eat the fragrant flat sedge rhizomes, and I have not actually tried these, but it's one of the ones that I really want to give a shot. Pine nuts, if you can go up to higher elevations, you can make your own pesto, especially if you harvest some wild greens. Thistle roots, thistles have for a long time been known as a famine food, and you can eat pretty much all of the thistle, but the roots are a lot more approachable than most of the other plants. And then wolfberries. So wolfberries are in the same plant group as goji berries, which you may or may not know as one of these superfoods. So wolfberries are really delicious. You can eat them right off the bush. And finally, in winter, great time for a lot of the leafy greens, dock leaf, esposa greens, lemon rocket leaves, but also cattail rhizomes and shoots make a nice starchy snack. You can also saute them. And this last one, the inner bark of a pine, I don't generally recommend the casual harvester to collect this, because it does kind of generally damage the plant. The edible part of the pine is also the part that allows the tree to transport nutrients up and down through its system. And so if you're very, very interested, you can take a small portion of it. I've been told it's not very tasty either, but just some of the plants that are described as edible generally aren't always the best option to collect. So let's look back at some of those questions that were asked. I think the first one. Yeah. Yeah, sorry, I was able to bring up the chat. So
okay, perfect.
Yep. So Randy asked, should certain plants only be eaten in moderation because of tannins, oxalates, or saponids? And that is very true. So another thing that you should know about each plant before you eat it is that a lot of these plants, or a number of these plants, have compounds within them that can cause a number of different issues. So kind of addressing, let's say, oxalates, generally in the form of oxalic acid, have been linked to different forms of kidney stones and digestive issues. So when you're eating these sorts of plants, you want to make sure that you do not eat too many of those. Tannins, which are also in wine, which gives wine a lot of its flavor, is a defensive mechanism of plants. So you also want to be wary of how much those you consume. There's a number of other chemicals that occur. So again, this is a kind of a know before you go. Make sure you know about these plants before you consume them. Let's see. Yep, purslane. It's a really great food to eat. So Charles is kind of discussing purslane and how it grows only under cultivation. So this is probably a case of a number of different, so how I describe it is a number of different species within a genus of purslane. And that basically means that within the larger purslane family, there's a number of different variations of it, and they will grow in different regions. So there are native purslanes that will grow around. And purslane generally needs a little bit more moisture than we're going to get in the desert floor, but they do grow wildly out here. Yes, and so Earl asked, isn't taking off such a large section of pine bark harmful to the tree? And as I was mentioning as well, if you take off the bark, you're exposing it to infection, and then the edible part, which is called the cambium, is also pretty much the life-giving part of the tree where it transports food and nutrients for itself. So although I did put it in the presentation, I really want to make the point that not everything that you find in a foraging book should you necessarily go out and consume at all or in large quantities, because it can be very damaging to those plants. Also tried to make the point that the cambium of trees is generally not the tastiest thing. There are recipes for turning it into bread or frying it, but generally I just wanted to use that as an example that to not always go and eat everything that you find out is edible. There is a difference between edible and palatable as well. Sometimes these things say they're edible, but they're not particularly tasty. So that's another thing that you'll learn as you go. And then Chris asked, how about green tender mesquite beans? Actually, I have not experienced eating the young beans, so I can't personally say. All my experience has been selecting mature ones that I ground into a flour. So my apologies. I don't know if there's another person out there that may have a better answer for that. I know there are other species of trees, like Palo Verdes, where you can eat the younger beans as a basically just off the pretty much straight off the tree. So although I can't say definitively, I'm not going to say that you can't eat those fresh. And then Carly's asking, do you need to dry out the mesquite beans after you harvest them? Generally, how I like to do it is let them dry on the tree before I collect them. And that way I don't have a bunch of young, wet mesquite beans that I then have to dry. What I would do though, if you are harvesting young ones, is yes, do let them dry out before you, before you grind them. And thank you, Jenna, for answering. You can eat the young mesquite just as they sprout. So that's good to know. As they get older, they do get very hard. And so you want to catch them very young. So yeah. All right. So if there are no other questions, I'll hop on to the next section. So the next topic is creating your own native garden. So somebody brought up earlier that they wanted to try and garden and do a native garden. And so we're going to kind of go into the very basics of that. As was mentioned before, there's a really good example of in Phoenix with your edible garden. Another example, if you happen to be down in Tucson, is Watershed Management Group has their own edible garden that is comprised of both natives and cultivated species that we irrigate with rain and also supplement with gray water as well. So be touching base very gently on all of these concepts. So if you are interested in creating a garden at your own home, it's a really good idea to understand the water needs of each of your plants. A lot of the desert species that we have out here have pretty low water needs, but some of them, especially if you go a little bit higher elevation plants, will need more water than if you get something down in the desert. So a really good practice if you're trying to cultivate a good garden and you don't want to irrigate a lot is creating something called a basin. And that's generally creating a low spot in your garden, which allows water to collect and infiltrate into the ground and also retains water for the plants for longer than if you just had it sheet flow across. And as you're creating those low points, you can also create different areas. In the lowest areas, you'll have your most water needy plants, and in your highest areas, you can have a lot more drought tolerant species. So kind of understanding a good structure of your yard is a good place to start. Let's say that you want to do something a little bit more intensive, and you might need a little bit of supplemental water to add to your garden. This is a really good, this water budget calculator is a good place to start. It allows you to calculate how much rainwater that you can collect and how much gray water you produce in your own household, and then allows you to figure out how much water you can budget out to the plants you have, whether that be directing the water directly from your roof into these basins to a number of different native plants, or maybe you have one citrus that has a very high water demand per year, or if you want to do something a little bit more involved, you can also get a rainwater tank that will collect water, and then you distribute that over a longer period of time, say to a garden, whether that be natives or cultivars or a mix of the two. So yeah. There are also additional benefits to creating your own green space in your yard. It allows you to create higher connectivity within our urban environment. So a lot of buildings and construction has kind of divided the larger ecosystem of the Sonoran Desert, and allowing little pockets of green space in your backyard, or if there's another area that you can cultivate, it allows connectivity, which will help different plants and animals survive. In addition, if you plant a couple other plants around the area that may not be edible but have lots of good blooms, you're creating food sources for different insects and animals that require them. Additionally, you may attract a lot of birds, both like the edible plants that you want to eat, but also the plants that will just attract them as well. So not only can you have a benefit to yourself, but you can also have a benefit to the environment as a whole. So are there any questions on that? I'll just scroll through that chat really quickly. It looks like a lot of questions on that, the Phoenix example, and it looks like those got answered in the chat. So if you're curious about that yourself, you can follow some of those those links to the different opportunities to see edible gardens or different gardens in around the Phoenix area, and it looks like also the Tucson area as well. That is a really good question, Randy. Randy asked, edibles like common mallow that grow in city parks and common areas, are these safe to eat after washing, or is reclaimed water or pesticides dangerous? And so I will, personally, I won't eat plants that are in these kind of municipal areas because I don't know what kind of chemicals they're using. A lot of these companies claim that their herbicides or their pesticides are safe after they've touched the dirt or after a certain amount of time, but there are a number of studies that are coming out now that are showing that's not necessarily the case. So I personally would not recommend eating plants that have been sprayed by herbicides or pesticides at all. If you have these sorts of plants that grow in your backyard or along kind of the roadsides that you are very aware of and you know that they're not being tainted, then I'll leave that up to your discretion. Some other concerns you may have are if they're in public areas, if animals have peed on them, or other contaminants that may not be chemicals, but may deter you from wanting to eat them. And then also kind of addressing this idea of reclaimed water. And this will tie back into creating your own garden. If you do want to supplement a garden with gray water, say from your washing machine or from your shower, kitchen sinks and toilets are counted as black water and you cannot use those. But these other sources are counted as gray water. Generally, what you want to do is not put them directly on plants that you're eating off the ground. So let's say greens, or if you have some cultivated plants like tomatoes or strawberries, you don't want to use gray water to water those because you're getting those contaminants directly on the fruit or edible parts of the plant. But it is okay to use it on something like a fruit tree, or if you're harvesting from a mesquite tree or something else like that, having that separation where the tree or the plant itself is able to process those is absolutely fine. And that's actually what we recommend when we do our gray water installs. Watershed does a lot of gray water installs, is that we direct it to either non-edible plants or to tree species. And just as a quick aside, if you are going to hook up a washing machine or a shower, you will have to be cognizant of the types of soaps and detergents you use. You want to make sure they are very low sodium. And if you can do it 0 sodium detergents, that is the best. There's 2 that are really helpful called Oasis and Biopack. And that's generally what we recommend, that they have no sodium in there. And essentially sodium will just kill your plants. They generally also have low levels of other chemicals that would be detrimental to the environment. So hopefully those are available to you. Make sure if you do it, just research what you're putting down those sinks or into your landscape. Yeah, are there any other questions? Okay, so we're gonna hop directly into some common edible plants in the Sonoran Desert. So this is only a small selection of some of the most common ones that you can find around. So we're going to first start with trees and shrubs. The first one is the Foothills Palo Verde. This is both wild and native. And as mentioned before, you can eat the seed pods, kind of like snap peas. You want to get them early. I'll answer that question in just a second, Chris. But you can also eat the flowers as well. Spring and summer is the time to harvest these. And so, yeah, so quickly jumping, Chris asked a question that I'll just address really quickly now, is why is kitchen sink water considered black water? So in Tucson for sure, and I believe as well Phoenix, it is rated by particulate matter. And so because kitchen sinks have a lot more particulate matter that come through them, they're rated as black water. That may not necessarily be the case if you go to different states or different areas, but specifically in Tucson, and I'm pretty sure in Phoenix, because of that reason, they're labeled as black water and you cannot pipe them out onto your landscape. So yeah, but hopping back into the common edible plants in the region, the next one is the desert ironwood, and very similar to the previous plant, you can also eat the peas like the pods like snap peas, and the flowers are also edible. And also another good time the best time to harvest them is in spring and summer. The next plant is the velvet mesquite, but there are other species of mesquite out there. There's the honey mesquite and the Scroobian mesquite. Just as a side, the Scroobian mesquite is struggling pretty hard in Arizona, but does well in the Texas region. So if you see Scroobians, maybe don't harvest them because they're not doing too well out here right now. But the velvet mesquite and the honey mesquite are both good plants to harvest those pods. The flowers are edible as well, and it's really nice to grind those into a flour and turn them into breads or other products. The honey mesquite, as you may assume by its name, is a little bit sweeter than the velvet mesquite, but the velvet mesquites are a little bit more common. And as mentioned before, be wary about eating dampened ripe pods because they can harbor fungus that produce aflatoxins, which are dangerous to humans. The next one is jojoba. Jojoba is a nice coffee substitute. You can grind up the seeds and roast them. This is one that has also shown that may not be the best to eat in large quantities. They do contain some other toxins and can have adverse effects. So make sure that you're processing them properly, but also eating them in proper quantities. Desert lavender has edible leaves and flowers. I've not personally harvested desert lavender, so I don't know the best way to consume them, but there are plenty of resources out there that will tell you good ways of preparation. Wolfberry, as I mentioned before, have delicious berries. Birds love them, so if you have a good source for finding them, you'll have some big competition. Jumping into succulents. So Cholla Buds are, as I mentioned before the presentation started, pickled Cholla Buds are probably one of my favorite things that I've eaten in the desert Southwest so far. The pickling process also will help dissolve those glockets, which are those tiny spines on them. So it's an added benefit to consuming them. But when collecting these, you definitely want to watch out for those glockets. They're pretty nasty, especially on the cholla. And the best way I've found of processing those, using tongs to collect them, throw them in a big bucket, and then if you can get a nice big mesh screen, lay them out on there, and you can either use some sort of way to abrade them with a brush, but I actually find that burning off the spines and glockets to be the best way to process those. Prickly pear, probably one of the more well-known plants to eat. You can eat their fruits. There's a number of different ways to process them. Prickly pear syrup is really common, but you can also eat the pads after taking off the spines. You can saute them up in a stir fry, or you can process them in a number of different ways. Some people even turn them into ice cream, so you can have prickly pear ice cream. Organ pipe, very similar fruits to the saguaro. This is another one that is probably going to be a little bit difficult to harvest because the organ pipe doesn't occur naturally except for in a very small portion of Arizona, which is protected and you cannot harvest from them, but they are very prolific through northern Mexico. So if you happen to be down there, then you may be able to harvest them. couple annuals as well. So I mentioned docks before, or desert rhubarb, depending on the different part that you harvest on the time of year. You can eat pretty much almost any part of this plant, the seeds, the stalks, the leaves, and also if you can find some nice roots, you can pickle those like carrots. Devil's claw, you can eat the immature fruit of those. I personally have never done this. I have a bunch of very dried devil's claw that look very inedible, but I've heard they're actually pretty tasty. Careless weed or amaranth is another good plant that you can harvest. The seeds and the young leaves go good in salads or in stir fries, and the seeds are just like the cultivated version of amaranth and can be used as a grain substitute. Our vines, so the one that we've kind of addressed before, Oregon grape, very delicious fruits. You can also eat the flowers and the young leaves. As the leaves get older, they get quite tough, and so I wouldn't eat the older leaves. And finally, this category called street food, which is addressing kind of the invasives. The main one I have on here is what's called Cecimbrian Hero or London Rocket. You can eat the flowers, seeds, and the young leaves on them. They make really good pestos, I've found, or you can blend them up. The seeds are essentially the wild version of mustard seeds. And so although they don't have the size or quite the same robust flavor, they can be used in a similar fashion or just eaten. So yeah, are there any additional questions? It looked like some of them have been answered in the chat. But yeah, anything else on any of those plants or something that you might want to specifically know? Cool. So the last part of our presentation is just general resources to help you get started. So if you're interested in continue to learn more about plants, here are a number of good resources. I personally really enjoy using SciNet, but as I mentioned, I have some like professional botanist training, so this may be a little bit more than what the average person may be interested in. Kind of the same for the USDA plants database. But there are other great resources like the books and websites listed below that make these a lot more accessible. So be certain to check those out if you're interested in that. Foraging resources. John Slattery has done 2 good books, both on foraging or edible and medicinal plants of the Southwest. I actually use his Southwest Desert Foraging quite often when I go out, so I very much enjoy that one. But Sonoran Desert Food Plants by Charles Kane is also a really good option. There's a couple others out there as well, so keep an eye out for which one that you like the best. For information on domesticated and introduced edible species, so this is really beneficial if you want to start your own garden. There are a bunch of different mission gardens around. We've kind of mentioned them, or mentioned a couple of different edible gardens. And then native seed search. I know there's a native seed search here in Tucson, and I imagine there's definitely one up in Phoenix as well. And they are a great resource for cultivars of plants that are desert adapted. So they might have wheat that is specifically grown in the desert, or squashes, or corns, or even other edible plants like tomatoes that will do much better in the desert than a average plant that you can buy from Home Depot will do. There's also Desert Gardening by George Brookbank, which is a great book resource as well. Finally, not finally, but another thing is addressing these endangered and protected species. This know before you go. Here are some good places to check before you go out and start harvesting. Definitely know your major species that you can't touch, and checking if you can even harvest on state and public lands, or if you need to get a permit, and if you can only harvest specific plants. These are all good resources to go to. Then finally, something that we didn't really cover that much in this presentation, because it could be its own entire presentation, is different ways of prepping and preparing the plants that you harvest. So these are all really good resources to look at, and hopefully when you become a little bit more comfortable with what you're harvesting, you can even experiment just a little bit and try out different recipes or different combinations of what you find. And so that's it for the presentation. Are there any final questions or something that hasn't been answered yet? So Randy asked, maybe a little bit off topic, but some Sonoran plants have very pleasant smelling leaves. Are there any in particular that can be used as perfume or cologne by rubbing on the skin? I will have to admit that I have a very bad sense of smell, so I have not personally focused on that. But I will say that I do know that creosote is one that has a very distinct smell. I've had friends that turn it into a salve for both good smelling purposes, but also for some of the medicinal properties in there as well. But beyond that, I don't actually know if there's some other ones that would do well. That would be a good place to research. Yeah.
All right, I don't see any other comments in the chat other than a lot of great information that you shared with us tonight. It was definitely a treat for us to hear your expertise on this topic. And I definitely want to thank all of our attendees for joining us tonight too. Oh, Joanne has a great question for you, James. What is your favorite desert edible?
So I think I mentioned a little bit before is that at least within the last year, my favorite one is pickled Cholla Buds. So I like to mix them in with some other pickled vegetables, whether those are foraged or bought from the store, and it just adds like an extra, like a nice new textural element to your pickles. So.
Thank you. Yeah, we'll have to come back and maybe do a poll one of these days and see what, since the class, what have we tried? What have we experimented with? What's our favorite? We'll have to go back and do a class follow-up poll. So thank you again, James, for this great presentation. Thank you all who joined us tonight. Again, just a reminder, I will send a follow-up email with the PowerPoint, resources, recording, and link to the survey. Remember, if you complete the survey by Monday, you'll be entered to win a free gift card from a local nursery, so be sure to fill that out by Monday. Our last workshop in our Spring Green Living series is called Cacti and Succulents for Desert Gardens, and that's happening on Wednesday, April 21st from 5:30 to 7, which is exactly 2 weeks from today. Thank you all again for joining us for such a great evening, and we hope to see you at the next one.